Mariah here with Red and Maple, and in today's video, I'd like to show you how to do the Longtail cast on. I think this might be the go-to cast on for most knitters. It's fast, stretchy, and it looks good on the edge of your fabric. Not only am I going to show you how to master this technique, but if you stick around till the end, I'm going to share some tips and tricks, including how to pick up a dropped cast on stitch. If you're new to the Longtail, then chances are you're also new to getting your hand set up in the slingshot position. So we are going to go over that first. You do need a long tail. You want to make a slip knot and put that on your needle. And the needle with the slip knot is going to go into your right hand. And I actually like to put my index finger on that slip knot during this process so it doesn't just slide off. And so now we have two strands coming off of our needle. One is the tail and one is the working yarn attached to the ball. You want to have that tail closer to you and the working yarn in the back. So we're going to get set up in the slingshot position. So with your left hand, you're going to take your index and thumb fingers together and you're going to put them into that opening between those two strands and open up your index and thumb fingers away from each other. So that's going to separate those two strands. And then those bottom three fingers are going to wrap around both strands of yarn that are hanging out in your palm. Now, and again, it's important to hang on to this stitch here, you're going to pull down and you're kind of pulling some yarn away from your index finger into the slingshot position. And it's called that because it looks like a slingshot. The first step is your right needle is going to come down and touch the base of your thumb and then slide your needle up to the tip of your thumb. So your needle has come up through that loop. Now the right needle is going to leave your thumb and rotate over to get that yarn that's wrapped around your index finger. So now I've wrapped the yarn from my index finger counterclockwise over my right needle. Now I can take my needle and go back down into that loop. So you can touch the needle to the tip of your thumb and slide it down so it goes through that loop. And now we have another stitch on our needle that we've cast on. So to reposition for the next stitch, you no longer need this loop on your thumb. So you're just going to take your thumb out and reposition by putting your thumb under that strand here and tightening up. And then the last piece, it's kind of tricky, is the yarn is kind of tight here on your index and kind of loose here on your thumb. You're going to pull so you get some slack from that index finger and not from the thumb. And now we're back in our slingshot position. So again, down to the base of the thumb, up through the loop on the thumb by sliding your needle along your thumb. Bring the needle over to that index yarn, wrapping that yarn around counterclockwise. Bring the needle tip back to the tip of your thumb and slide down all the way so it goes to that loop. And then you can bring your needle off of your palm towards you. Now we have our third stitch and we don't need this thumb loop anymore. Bring the thumb out and reposition. And I'm going to do that a little bit faster. And essentially, again, knitting is pulling loops through loops. So we have a loop on our thumb. We're grabbing some yarn from our index and pulling that yarn through the loop on our thumb. So one problem that people will have with the Longtail cast on is casting it on too tight. And you'll know you cast it on too tight when you notice that the bottom edge of your cast on kind of seems to curve. And so you can see that it's narrower down here. So that has been done too tight. And if you feel like your cast on is not stretchy enough, I have a trick for you. So essentially what's happening when we are casting on too tight is the space between these stitches is not there. So they end up being really close together and they don't move along the needle real easily. And you'll hear often people suggest just cast on with a bigger needle. All that really does is makes these loops bigger, but it won't separate them from each other. And really that's what you need. You need that space between them. And so in order to do that evenly, so you have evenly spaced stitches, what I like to do is that index finger again on my right hand, I'm going to place it right on the needle. It's slightly off of the stitch I just made and I'm touching the needle with my fingertip. So as I go through my motion and I go to tighten that stitch, I tighten it just so it gets to the tip of my index finger. And then I move my index finger to touch the needle for the next one. So that index finger is my guide to make sure all of these stitches stay evenly apart. So one of the problems with the long tail cast on is that you have to figure out how long to make your tail. So another trick is instead to use the strand of yarn from one side of your ball and then another strand of yarn from the other side. So I have my yarn from the outside and now I have found the yarn from the inside. You could also, if you have multiple balls of yarn, you could take yarn from two different balls. And so what we're going to do is take those two strands of yarn. And now it doesn't matter how long the tail is. You just want enough to weave in those ends. I like about 6 to 10 inches. And we're going to make our slip knot with both strands. And the trick here is that this double stranded slip knot is not going to be one of our stitches. So now I have two strands of yarn coming from my slip knot, and I'm going to set myself up for that slingshot position just as I did before. And now if you notice as you're doing your long tail cast on, you have the strand of yarn wrapped around your thumb that would be your tail. It is attached also to your ball of yarn. So you will not run out of yarn when doing this cast on. When you finish casting on, you'll notice you still have two strands of yarn attached to your needle. So you're simply going to get your scissors and pick which strand you don't want to knit with anymore. So if you like pulling from the center, cut the strand that's coming from the outside of the ball and vice versa. So we're going to cut one of those strands. And now we have our short tail and our strand that we're going to knit with. And finally, when you work back across, you're going to get to that double stranded slip knot. And remember, we said that's not one of your stitches. So when you get to it, simply throw it off the needle and you can pull the slip knot out. And the only downside I find to this method is now you have two extra tails to weave in. So you're getting a couple extra strands to weave in. That's a downside, but I think it's a small price to pay to make sure you never run out of yarn. So for me, one of the worst things that could happen is after I've casted on a whole bunch of stitches for my long tail, I accidentally drop one of the stitches and it unravels. So this meant that I would rip everything out and start over. But it's actually really simple to pick these up and not have to start over again. If you drop a cast on stitch from your long tail cast on, the first thing I need you to do is just turn your work around and we're going to pick it up from the other side. Try to look for is that you have these two strands between your needles. One of the strands is longer and one of the strands is shorter. If you really can't tell, what you can do is on your right needle, that stitch, when you pull on it, you should see the longer stitch, the longer strand gets shorter. So that's how you know which one is the longer one. We're going to start with our left needle and picking up that shorter strand. And to do that, we're going to bring the needle from the top and go down between those two stitches and then come towards you. So now I have that shorter strand draped over my left needle. Now we need to get that long strand draped over the left needle. And I think the easiest way to do this is to take the right needle. You're going to come from the back and towards you, going again between those two strands, and then away from you to grab that strand. And now we're going to slip this strand we picked up over onto the left needle, but you want to do it from the front to the back. Now it should look like you have these two strands hanging out on your needle, kind of angled towards each other. And the last piece is you're going to grab that first strand and slip it over and off the second one. And we have picked up that drop stitch. Now you'll notice that your working yarn is still attached to this stitch and not to that one. So we're going to slip that stitch that we just picked back up over onto our right needle. And now we can turn our work and go back to knitting without having to start over. And that's how you do the long tail cast on. I'd be curious to know if any of these tips and tricks were helpful for you. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to let us know in the comments.